Good afternoon, everyone. It's a couple of minutes past noon, and welcome to the Korea Society's office at 350 Madison Avenue in Midtown Manhattan, and thank you all for coming here in person. Today's program title is Force Multiplier, the U.S. Korea Alliance Amid Strategic Competition. And thank you all for joining us. My name's Tom Byrne, and I'm the President and CEO of the Korea Society. As the world contends with competing strategic alignments, overlapping with and affecting Northeast Asia, today's conversation will focus on how the U.S. Korea Alliance can rise to the challenge of an increasingly complex and uncertain geopolitical environment. We are honored to be joined today by our esteemed panelists, Seth Bailey. Hi, Seth. Welcome to the Korea Society. Became director of the Office of Korean and Mongolian Affairs at the U.S. State Department in July 2023. His last assignment was in Honolulu as a visiting professor and senior diplomatic fellow at the DoD-affiliated Asia-Pacific Center for Security Studies. From 2019 to 2022, Seth served as the Minister Counselor for Political Affairs at the U.S. Embassy, Beijing, where he led negotiations with the PRC. Markus Garlauskas, is the director of the new Indo-Pacific Security Initiative of the Atlantic Council Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. He leads the initiative's efforts focused on security, prosperity, and freedom in the Indo-Pacific region. He formerly served as America's National Intelligence Officer for North Korea. Rachel Minyoung Lee, hi Rachel, welcome to the Korea Society, is a senior fellow for the Stimson Center's Korea program in 38 North. Lee was a North Korea expert analyst with open source enterprise in the U.S. government from the year 2000 to 2019. Before we begin the conversation, I want to thank the Korea Foundation and our corporate sponsors, the names of which are prominently displayed in the lobby, for making this program possible. We are welcoming your questions live. We will provide an opportunity for in-person attendees to ask questions directly, and you get the first question since you showed up here. And for our virtual audience, please send your questions throughout the program to policy@koreasociety.org. Jonathan Corrado, our moderator, will lead today's discussion. And before I say over to you, I just want to say that we have our chair, Ambassador Kathy Stevens, attending this program as well. So Jonathan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Tom. Thanks everyone for showing up in person today and for watching us virtually. We had a late night last night, so thanks to all our panelists for putting on your morning faces and getting out here ready to rock. A lot to talk about. This is a dream lineup for me of All-Stars, so I'm going to get right to it because I have the easiest job here by far. You guys have the hard work to do. Seth, I want to start with you and just ask for bird's eye view of Alliance, because in a lot of ways we're as close as we've ever been with South Korea, and yet the challenges that we face are as threatening as they've ever been. So what are we doing to make sure that we're in a good place? And I can prime you with one thing, which is these historic achievements in the trilateral cooperation with Korea and Japan. And I know some headway was made recently there, and we've got some more coming up. So hoping you could tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you to the Korea Society. It's really a pleasure to be here with all of you today, and looking forward to a really robust discussion. I think your question is a great way to start this discussion because it kind of does highlight this best of times, worst of times dynamic that we have going on. Not really the worst of times. It could be worse. Hopefully it doesn't get worse. And, close to the best of times in a lot of ways, especially trilaterally. I think that we are very clear-eyed about the way in which the DPRK is accelerating their provocations. And, the U.S. ROC Alliance is well positioned to address that. And I want to talk specifically about some of the threats that we see and some of the ways that we are trying to address that. But first, I kind of want to take a quick step back and say something that may be deemed a little outdated or even naive, but I think it's important that we continue to stress and we continue to remember at the outset that conflict with North Korea is not inevitable. The DPRK may have chosen confrontation at this point, but that isn't required. It is not inevitable. Instead, the DPRK has a stark choice, and any progress it is making at the moment obviously pales in comparison to the progress that it could make and is available to it through better choices. So again, that may seem outdated, but we have stressed repeatedly through both public and private channels, such as this one, that we're willing to engage the DPRK in a number of discussions, that we don't have to begin with the denuclearization discussion, although we remain deeply and firmly committed to denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. But still, there are opportunities for us to engage, and North Korea needs to make better choices. Unfortunately, as you highlighted, there are a number of ways in which North Korea is making bad choices, and those choices are having a material and very negative impact, not just on South Korea and Northeast Asian security, but also globally. And I think that we need to think about what North Korea is doing more frequently in a global sense. And three areas that I would identify at the outset. The first is, of course, North Korea's weapons proliferation. And there we see North Korea's willingness to supply Russia with weapons, and frankly other areas as well, as very destabilizing and something that is new and different and is a global threat to peace and stability. Secondarily, I think that we need to consider the global threat that North Korea poses through their very aggressive and robust cyber hacking program. And this is a program designed primarily to hack into other countries' defense industrial companies. It is sophisticated and sometimes is successful. It is aimed not just at the United States or the UK or Germany or Korea, but even at Russia and China. And so that's an issue that I think we need to think about, again, on a global scale. Finally, one that is a little newer, but still very threatening, and perhaps in some ways the most threatening, has to do with North Korea's cyber-enabled theft of cryptocurrency. And their cryptocurrency theft over the course of the last 3-4 years has provided them with tremendous resources. By a number of open source calculations, North Korea's responsible for well over 60% of all cryptocurrency theft, and the vast majority of that money is being used to fund North Korea's weapons programs. So these three programs, these three issues are in fact global issues, and the U.S. ROK Alliance is of course designed to focus on protection of the Republic of Korea, of Northeast Asia, of the U.S. ROK-Japanese trilateral relationship. But in many respects, we are going out together and talking to our European colleagues, to our Southeast Asian colleagues, to even African countries about the threats that are posed to them by these three global threats. So, the alliance is in fact very robust. It is growing. The trilateral relationship is in uncharted territory in terms of how good it is. Cutting across all sectors: economic, financial, technological, military, people to people. And yet, we are presented with this very stark and very real challenge that we continue to try to address. So I'll stop there.
Excellent.
Look forward to more.
Yeah, so much food for thought. And I'll just follow up with one, and then Markus and Rachel invite you for any just quick follow-ups, comments, questions on that one. Wanted to follow up on the sanctions campaign, and what strikes me is how much they've been able to compensate for this through their crypto heists, and almost approaching a parity of the export revenue that they earned through all of their illicit activities. So now the question is, after Russia vetoes the panel of experts mandate and basically puts a grinding halt on any new sanctions coming through the Security Council, what's next for the sanctions campaign to stop that proliferation and that illicit currency earning?
Yeah, this is an excellent question. So maybe a couple of components that I'll address very briefly, and happy to drill down later. But on the 1718 Committee's panel of experts and Russia's really ridiculous veto of renewal of the panel of experts, there, I think that we are working with the ROCs, Japanese, Europeans, and others to come up with a number of different mechanisms that will not necessarily replace the panel of experts, but will in fact continue to shine a spotlight on North Korea's bad behavior, and will also shine a spotlight on those countries that are helping North Korea evade sanctions. So I think that in reality, we're close to being able to um, uh, demonstrate that this behavior from Russia is actually going to backfire, and that if anything, there will be more countries interested and more countries involved in an effort to try and continue to shine this spotlight. The sanctions evasion, of course, is a very serious concern. We continue to impose unilateral sanctions, and we have evidentiary standards that allow us to do that more frequently than perhaps European colleagues who typically rely on an evidentiary standard that is completely unclassified and perhaps could withstand court challenges. We continue to work with our colleagues in Brussels to try and convince them that they should be a little more forward-leaning on the sanctions regime. And of course, we're working with Korea to continue to catch and stop bad behaviors. But it is a constant kind of back and forth. And North Korea is the best in the world at sanctions evasion. So we'll continue to try and stop them.
Excellent. Well, good news that there's a lot of improvisation and the hard work continues. Markus and Rachel, any follow-ons?
Yeah, so you touched a little bit on the North Korea-Russia relationship and how central Russia is to some of the problems we're facing with North Korea right now. So I'm curious if you could share any more thoughts on how we're thinking about these days the North Korea-Russia relationship and what we can really do about it.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think we're all aware of how serious the threat is. I mean, millions of rounds of ammunition, over 80 ballistic missiles that have actually been fired from Russia into Ukraine, dozens more that are available. And so the trend, I think, is unlikely to change and is continuing to be very serious, having a material impact on the lives of Ukrainians. There have been actual loss of life and casualties, massive amounts of damage as a result of North Korea's support for Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine. We continue to do a number of things in order to try to address that. So we have our sanctions regime. We have our attempts to stop North Korea's ability to build and develop more weapons. That continues unabated. We're not going to stop that. We're going to continue to double down on that. We're also working harder with our European colleagues, as I mentioned before. I traveled to Brussels twice last year. Much more senior diplomats and officials than I have done the same. And I think that we are making progress with the Europeans as they take additional steps that at this point I'll can leave a little vague, but additional steps to focus more attention on the DPRK and Russia and ways in which they can disrupt and interrupt that trade. And I think in addition to that, it's important for us to recognize the role that China plays here.
Right.
I think that China sometimes would like to have it both ways, talk about upholding the UN Charter, stay in the shadows, and at the same time, very unhelpfully support Russia's reconstitution of its defense industrial base, and abstain when Russia destroys the panel of experts and things along those lines. We have had very senior level engagement with PRC officials, including Secretary Blinken's most recent discussion with Foreign Minister Wang Yi last week. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan also met Wang Yi in Beijing a couple of weeks ago. The DPRK has been a focus of our conversations. It will continue to be, and we'll continue to try and convince the PRC that Northeast Asian security and regional stability depends on their taking more concrete and concerted actions here.
Rachel, anything on your end?
Yeah, so Seth, thank you for your comments. I thought I would ask you about the new Japanese Prime Minister's article on the Hudson Institute's website. He called for the creation of an Asian version of NATO, and also called on America to share nuclear weapons or the introduction of nuclear weapons into the region. How realistic do you think that is? Just thought I could get your thoughts on that.
Ooh, Rachel asking the spicy questions. I like it.
Straight for it. I have to admit that I haven't read the article. I will say that under the Biden-Harris administration, we have devoted more attention to alliance development than ever before. And as a result, we see that the alliances are deeper and broader than they've ever been before. And of course, there's no better example of that at this time than the U.S. ROC-Japan trilateral relationship. And so, this alliance structure is often referred to as a lattice work. Those who want to detract from it sometimes call it an Asian NATO. There's a lot of different terms that get thrown around. But the key here, going back to Jonathan's original question, is that the alliance is stronger and deeper and more capable of addressing the challenges that face us, not just regionally, but globally. So I haven't read the article. I will. I'll go read it. It sounds very interesting. But our commitment to deepening and strengthening the alliance structure is only going to grow.
So that was a great question and a great answer. I'll just add that I listened to a podcast by The Economist today talking about that article and raising the question. And this Economist journalist spoke to people on the transition team and said that was more campaign style conversation, and that when he actually gets into office, it's going to be a little bit more about continuity. So that's perhaps reassuring.
Yeah.
Okay, Markus, over to you. You've done some really path-breaking work on two items which are of crucial interest to this conversation. The first one's going to be the possibility of a deterrence failure on the Korean Peninsula. How could that happen? Right, everything seems very nice right now. Like we've got it under control, but you've highlighted a couple of risk areas that we ought to pay attention to. And then the second one, and on a related note, is the possibility of a dual contingency crisis in Northeast Asia involving, everyone's focused on Taiwan right now. What if China invades? What does that mean for the region? And you've directed our attention to look a little bit broader, because that could invite an opportunity for Kim Jong-un to take some action at that point as well. So are we prepared for that type of scenario? So over to you.
Yeah, so to be honest, this is something we could do a whole panel just on this subject, so I'll just try and hit the high points. So first of all, so much of how we think about and talk about deterrence in the region is based, I think, on a backward-looking paradigm that doesn't take into account the changes, including some that Seth just talked about, in the regional environment. And then, of course, the changes in North Korean capability. And then also, I think we set the bar probably in the wrong place when we think about deterrence, and so you see these studies and these reports and these discussions about deterrence of a North Korean offensive to take over South Korea as sort of a 1950 a redo of what Kim Il Sung tried to accomplish. Or you look at deterrence of a PRC all-out invasion of Taiwan, sort of a amphibious fait accompli to try and overrun the island in days or weeks with just massive amounts of force all at once on short notice. And I think if you're talking about deterring those types of scenarios, these all-out offenses to completely absorb South Korea or Taiwan, I actually think the strength of deterrence is probably better than we give it credit for. The problem is we're setting the bar in the wrong place if we have that conversation. We think about it in those terms. And so what we've seen from North Korea and from the PRC consistently, I think, recently, but in the case of North Korea, going really decades back, is this escalation in what some are calling the gray zone space, the escalation short of full-scale war. And particularly what I'm concerned about is the potential for the high end in that gray zone of actual limited aggression, lethal action. So not just testing weapons or maritime sorts of incursions like what the PRC is doing, what North Korea has done in the past, but real lethal escalation, which again has occurred, particularly for North Korea in the past. But then that's one area. where I'm concerned about deterrence crumbling. And then another area where I think we should be concerned is if a conflict does occur, even if it's intended to be a limited aggression or a limited conflict, how do we keep that conflict from trending into the nuclear threshold with a limited nuclear attack? Those are the two areas where I have real concerns. And the reason why, well, there's a whole range of reasons why, but so many things have changed. Both North Korea and China are increasing their capability to threaten the homeland of the United States with nuclear weapons. And of course, China has a huge head start in this regard, and they just tested this ICBM into the Pacific to really underscore their ability to reach the United States. And we've seen the reports from the Pentagon and elsewhere about the tremendous growth that we're going to see in the PRC's ICBM arsenal. And so the ability to hold the U.S. homeland at risk is going to have an impact on the credibility of U.S. extended deterrence, the credibility of the U.S. to be able to take the fight to China if it conducts aggression against Taiwan. And then in the same way, North Korea's ability to strike the U.S. homeland is improving. There's still, constant, debate and question until they do that full range ICBM test and maybe even, a nuclear detonation at the end. Until that moment comes, there'll always be this uncertainty, this doubt about how credible really is it. But then you have, in addition to that, both North Korea and the PRC dramatically increasing their ability to use nuclear weapons at the theater level, right? And in a regional capability, or in the case of North Korea, very tactical on peninsula capability. And at the same time, also you have the PRC and North Korea increasing their capability to conduct limited acts of aggression through a variety of means in a way that's much more precise, much more discriminating, much more effective than what they had in the past. And I've talked about this, here at the Korea Society before. If you think back to 2010, when North Korea attacked Yeonpyeong Island, they were using artillery, guns and rockets. They killed civilians. They didn't really achieve a whole lot of military effect. But 14 years of military development later, with North Korea's improvements in their ballistic missiles, guided rockets, drones, all these sorts of capabilities, the ability to do something much more damaging, much more effective, and also potentially without even inflicting civilian casualties unintentionally or intentionally. I think you combine all three of those: the backstop of the nuclear shadow of the ability to threaten the United States, the ability to escalate more effectively to a limited nuclear use, limited nuclear attack, and then to, in this sort of gray zone area, conduct very discriminating but effective attacks with various means. Those in combination really stress deterrence a great deal, and I think it requires us to think about it differently. And so to cut to the chase, though, where this really becomes a problem is in the event we have a contingency on the Korean Peninsula that escalates to the point where the survival of the regime is at stake, right? Because they've gotten themselves into something that's well beyond perhaps what they had intended, and then this basically puts the North Korean regime in a position where one of two things potentially enables their survival: either the intervention of the PRC, or the threat or use of nuclear weapons to get the alliance to back off. So this is a challenge area. And then conversely, looking at a Taiwan scenario, think about the implications for North Korea if the United States defeats the PRC in a major war, what that means for North Korea. And so the potential for them to stay on the sidelines. So it's not just opportunism. It's not just opportunism. But it's the fact that the North Korean regime's interests are so tremendously affected by the potential for a PRC defeat by the United States. And conversely, if the PRC defeats the United States and North Korea sits on the sidelines, then the whole region could be reordered in a way that isn't necessarily to North Korea's interest either. So those are a couple of the different permutations. But at the end, it's all this interconnectivity of the challenge posed by China, by North Korea, and then the support that Russia is providing to North Korea, and how the Russia-China relationship is increasingly growing into the military space with these joint bomber flights, we saw by Alaska. It's making the deterrence challenge much more difficult to deal with. And at the end of the day, to provide space for diplomacy, I think you have to have deterrence, right? Because if deterrence fails, then the diplomacy is going to be trying to bring an end to a conflict that may not be possible really to control through diplomacy.
You've thoroughly scared us, Markus.
It is the worst of times.
Yeah, in many ways. You also pointed to some, I think they're rather asides in your comments, but some aspects of which relate to alliance management and the difficulty thereof, because I think escalation management is going to be more difficult perhaps in the future than it was with the Cheonan sinking and when with the bombardment of Yeonpyeong-do. We have a president in South Korea, Yoon Suk-yeol, who has pledged to retaliate multiple times, right? And a new defense minister who has molded perhaps South Korea one day acquiring nuclear weapons. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the alliance management piece of this and how that's part of a solution.
Sure, yeah. So I think one of the key things to keep in mind is that what it takes to assure the people of South Korea, the South Korean government, and different elements of the political spectrum, different elements of society that pay different levels of attention to deterrence issues. What it takes to convince that range of audiences that deterrence is strong and that South Korea does not need its own nuclear weapons in order to have effective deterrence. I think, unfortunately, that's a bit different than what it takes to actually deter North Korea. And so the focus so much has been on assuring our South Korean allies within the relationship that deterrence is strong. U.S. Extended nuclear deterrence will make it unnecessary, even destabilizing for South Korea to have its own nuclear weapons. And I think that's a fair point. It's understandable line of effort. And then in the same time, I think there is a demand signal from Seoul of greater reassurance from the United States. But so much of it has been focused on these ideas of inflicting massive punishment and retaliation on North Korea, emphasizing the U.S. nuclear capability to respond. If North Korea uses a nuclear weapon, then the U.S. can use nuclear weapons. These sorts of themes keep coming to the forefront, right? And what is, I think, less in evidence is how do we increase the resilience of the alliance, of South Korea, of the U.S. military presence in South Korea, in the face of a nuclear attack from North Korea or even a non-nuclear attack. Because the more we focus on the ability to punish North Korea with strikes or the ability of the U.S. to retaliate with nuclear weapons, the more I think we're just feeding into this narrative of North Korea that we're the problem, but also the more it actually in some ways incentivizes North Korea to keep building their nuclear capability. If we focus on resilience and emphasize that North Korea will not be able to gain advantage through these capabilities they're developing, and that even if they were to use a nuclear weapon, the regime is still going to be defeated, right? That the nuclear weapons are not a magic system that can just solve all of North Korea's operational and strategic problems. I think that's a much better place to approach things. But unfortunately, in the alliance, that's a difficult conversation to have. There's another key element, too, that I want to emphasize that's a difficult conversation that needs to be had, is that South Korea very clearly and understandably does not want to get dragged into a war between China and the United States. Right? Mm-hmm. I think everyone can understand that. No one wants to have a war between China and the United States, I think. But if you're a country caught there in the region, you do not want to be in the middle of that. Right. But the problem is that based on the analysis, the war game, the tabletop exercises we have done, it would be difficult, if not impossible, at the end of the day, to be confident that South Korea could stay out, even if it exerted every possible effort. Mm-hmm. Even if it abandoned its alliance commitments to the United States, for example, right? And so the issue becomes not how does South Korea stay out of a U.S.-China war, but how can South Korea contribute to preventing the U.S.-China war? How can it help reinforce deterrence? How can it play a productive role in diplomacy instead of pulling back in a way that might actually encourage the PRC to believe that South Korea would remain neutral and that U.S. forces in Korea would stay out, and this sort of thing, which might be the very thing that undermines deterrence, that convinces the PRC that the balance is there, that they could achieve their goals vis-a-vis Taiwan through a military solution, right? So I think the way for South Korea to stay out of a U.S.-China conflict has got to be to help prevent that conflict, to help deter it.
That's why I like you, Markus. First you scare us, and then you show us the light and show us a better way.
Yeah, deterrence can hold. Deterrence can hold. We just have to work on it.
Okay, so Seth, Rachel, any follow-ons, comments?
Please.
Marcus, how worried should we be about Russia's military involvement or intervention in a Northeast Asia conflict?
So I think there's a sliding scale, right? And we have to recognize right now that there is a degree of engagement between North Korea and Russia that we have not seen, certainly since the collapse of the Soviet Union, right? Russia as an entity itself, since it went from the Soviet Union to Russia, we haven't seen anything like this. And so that means Russia's already involved, right? And the question is, how much military force did they bring into a contingency? Those are open questions. I think it's very variable. But as far as their ability to provide technological support, diplomatic support, logistical support, that's all there. It's essentially, happening already. And the White House very, very, I think, presciently and correctly, very early on in this relationship development between Russia and North Korea and the Ukraine support, identified some key areas of technological cooperation where the North Koreans could benefit. Things like missile production, fighters and air defense capabilities, and all these sorts of things. And so, even if the Russians were not actually to contribute a single ship or aircraft of their own to the fight, the potential for Russia in many ways to support North Korea could be the thing that again undermines deterrence on the margins, and that makes it much more challenging to counter North Korean aggression. But I certainly wouldn't rule out the idea that if a contingency develops into a full-scale war, I wouldn't rule out the idea that Russian forces could be involved, especially as it spreads again potentially into a wider regional conflict. So, but I think the Russians they're already involved. That's part of the problem.
Yeah, that's very interesting, and really appreciate that kind of laydown of just how complex the problems are. I wonder if you would be willing to provide kind of an assessment of how you see China and Russia's relationship shifting as things with North Korea continue to change and develop, and if you see any changes in how China is perceiving the problems.
Yeah, so this is a tough one to figure out, and to be fair, there's a lot of debate about how concerned is China really about the burgeoning relationship between North Korea and Russia. And so there is certainly a school of thought that China is very worried about this and what it might mean in that it empowers North Korea to destabilize the region in a way that doesn't serve China's interests, and also it reduces the PRC's potentially even their leverage and influence over Russia, and that North Korea is an alternative source of the resources that Russia needs to continue the war. But I think, in point of fact, though, how China is worried or irritated may not matter that much, based on when you look at the history of how how China has treated North Korea. There's a lot of things that they are worried about or they object to, but in the end they end up enabling, right? And so China's had this principle for the longest time. The PRC has wanted North Korea not to test and develop nuclear weapons, and then yet at the end of the day, the way it's behaved is essentially given top cover for North Korea to do exactly that. And so my view is that the Russia-China relationship, is very much prioritizing right now. I should say, is the priority versus China's concern about what's going on between Russia and North Korea, and in particular, the fact that the Chinese are essentially benefiting in many ways from they're supporting Russia's industrial base, but they're not, other than you see some reports occasionally, really China is not providing, directly, weapons, at least not, on the scale that North Korea is. And so this essentially allows China to benefit in that North Korea and Iran, provide, drones and North Korean missiles and artillery, and then, but the PRC can avoid crossing that red line of not actually providing weapons. So in a way, China benefits from this too. So I mean, I can see both sides of it, and I'm sure they're to some degree they're concerned, they're watching it, they're monitoring, but at the end of the day, they're tolerating it, they're abetting it, and enabling it. And so, however irritated or worried they are, if it doesn't fundamentally change the behavior, this is a real problem.
I want to invite both Rachel and Seth to take a bite out of that same apple, because this is a really rich one, right? How are China-Russia relations changing right now, given the North Korea of it all?
So this is a tough question, right? But very important, just given the impact that China has in the region. I agree with Marcus that even if China was concerned, they're not really doing anything to change North Korea's behavior or to rein in what is happening between the North Koreans and the Russians. So, that clearly, I think, has had implications. And I think we've seen that playing out between Kim Jong-un and Putin, starting with the treaty, for example, that was signed in June. I think the other angle that we might want to look at this from is the North Korea-China relationship bit of the puzzle. And I have been watching with interest how that relationship has evolved over the past year. One of the themes that I was going to touch upon in my opening comments was the strain in the relationship between the North Koreans and the Chinese over the past 1 year. And the big question mark here is, from a North Korea point of view, is this a tactical, hedging behavior, right? We often talk about the North Koreans hedging, right? Their bets going back and forth between the Russians and the Chinese, which is what they did in the Cold War. Is that what's happening now? So is this like more tactical, short term, or has there been a more fundamental shift in how Pyongyang views China? And I bring this up because, this has been going on for over a year. And this year marks the 75th anniversary of the forging of ties between the North Koreans and the Chinese. But if you look at what's happening, you would think that relationship was that anniversary was between the North Koreans and the Russians. There's really nothing going on between the Chinese and the North Koreans. So then the strain in North Korea's relationship with China, how is this going to impact North Korea's relationship with Russia, how it behaves, going forward, and more broadly, regional security. What implications would this have for regional security dynamic? I mean, we have the North Koreans talking about creating some kind of a new security dynamic, with the Russians, creating with the Russians a new multipolar world. And I think these are words that we need to pay attention to.
Yeah, I think all excellent points. You both identified very difficult, almost impossible to solve problems. I think I would just attack it from one other angle, and that is that when it comes to questions about China, North Korea, and Russia, sometimes we have a tendency to talk about it in terms of influence, and this country's influence is waning or waxing. This country, what's the relationship like? And there is another piece of this, which is just leverage, and the question of which countries still actually have leverage, and it's different from influence. So I think that it's a legitimate question and concerning question about whether or not China still has the influence that it once had. But it does still have leverage, I believe. And I think that there are things that China can do to have a material impact on how robustly North Korea is able to engage in its weapons development and weapons proliferation and cryptocurrency theft and cyber-enabled hacks of defense industry bases. China has the ability to affect those. Now, the steps that it would have to take in order to have an impact on those are sometimes more of a blunt instrument than a scalpel.
Sure.
But, just looking at cryptocurrency, for example, there is an alarming amount of cryptocurrency theft that is then being laundered through illegal operations in China, through over-the-counter traders, through facilitators. And North Korea has a number of these facilitators that they trust, and China can do more to put pressure on those facilitators to prosecute them, to take them out of the system, which would of course force North Korea to rely on less trusted facilitators and make it more difficult for them to accomplish their goals. So the leverage exists. It is possible to have an impact on these things, and then the question becomes one of how we can make the diplomatic case to incentivize not just China or Russia, but including North Korea, to make better choices and return to a more diplomatic approach.
Just to build on that, we see that Russia, North Korea, and China are aligned on their interest in challenging the rules-based order, and they all benefit from the kind of chaos that North Korea has the potential of causing. But at the end of the day, they don't really share fundamental deep values, much in the way that the U.S. trilateral really does. I mean, U.S., Korea, and Japan really share deep values, and that's something that undergirds the relationship. So when you compare the strategic interests that Russia versus China has in the Korean Peninsula, I mean, Korean War redux, Russia's down to cause havoc and challenge the status quo and destabilize things, and China will be left holding the bag. So they should know that and act now before that happens. That's my 2 cents there. Rachel, so you've done, sorry that we kind of got derailed, but you've done such excellent analysis on this strategic pivot that North Korea's taken, because there's been, tends to invite speculation about just what's going on. But as was mentioned in the introduction, you've got 19 years of experience doing explicitly this, trying to analyze what North Korea is doing, what its state media is telling us about what they're doing. So I wonder if you could give us a read about what's motivating this shift that we're seeing from Kim Jong-un, the turn away from a lot of things, away from unification, away from engagement with the United States, away from China. What are the deeper factors going there? And you started talking about this a little bit in your previous response, but just to build there.
Yeah, thank you, Jonathan, for that. And first of all, thank you to Korea Society and the Atlantic Council for organizing this event and bringing me on board. I'm delighted to be here. Exactly 2 years ago, I was here in this room talking about what to me felt like a broader foreign policy shift, North Korea's foreign policy shift. And at the time, we didn't really know if that was a thing, like if it really was a fundamental foreign policy shift. And I think in the last 1 or 2 years, we have seen maybe stronger evidence of that. So I think this is one of those moments where, as an analyst, I should feel joy in the fact that maybe I was right at the time. But I absolutely feel no joy in saying that maybe I was right at the time. Just given how the situation has evolved over the past 2 years. And I can also admit that even though I did talk about a more fundamental North Korean foreign policy shift 2 years ago, I could not have imagined North Korea-Russia relationship reaching this level of new heights. And probably nobody could have predicted that. So North Korea's foreign policy shift, a fundamental shift, what I mean by that is North Korea shifting away from its U.S. foreign policy, U.S. policy of normalizing relations with Washington through denuclearization. And when I say this, I don't mean that North Korea will never engage the U.S. What I mean is normalization of relations with the U.S. through denuclearization seems to be off the table for the North Koreans. That's what I mean by a strategic shift, a shift in North Korea's U.S. policy. At the same time, we have seen North Korea realigning with China and Russia. And we have also seen Pyongyang making a fundamental shift in its South Korea and unification policy, whereby Kim Jong-un late last year and again earlier this year defined inter-Korean relations as a relationship between two belligerent states and renouncing North Korea's decades-long policy of peaceful unification with South Korea. So what accounts for this shift, right? I think there are two converging factors here. The first one is the collapse of the Hanoi summit. This keeps coming up in all my conversations, so I feel like a broken record for saying this. But we do really have to go back to the breakdown of the Hanoi summit. And I think that has raised some fundamental questions about the basic premise of North Korea's U.S. policy among the top leadership in Pyongyang. And secondly, North Korea's understanding or perception of the shifting global order. I think North Korea saw opportunities in what we call great power competition, the growing rift between the U.S. and both China and the United States, and just waning U.S. leadership on the global stage. When you look at North Korean media, how closely they tracked how the U.S. pulled out from Afghanistan, I think that had a big impact in terms of how North Korea looked at where the U.S. stood on the global stage and its leadership. One thing I would like to highlight also is that the realignment with China and Russia began before the war in Ukraine. That the war only accelerated this pivot, particularly toward Russia. It didn't begin with Putin's invasion of Ukraine. So Russia, as we have talked about, stands in the background of all of this, right? The deepening, expanding ties with Russia, raising concerns on multiple fronts. I think a lot of our discussions about North Korea's improving relations with Russia have focused on the military aspects, right? Potential transfers of military technologies to North Korea, possible Russian involvement, military involvement in case of a conflict. I would like to draw your attention to other factors that I think that we need to think about. And the first one is perceived opportunities. What opportunities does Kim Jong-un see by improving relations with Russia? And there are domestic factors driving this. There are, of course, external factors driving this. There are opportunities on all fronts. I think, for Kim appears to see opportunities for improving the economy, gaining greater international legitimacy through his friendship with Putin, even becoming a bigger player on the international stage. And all of which I think give Kim even less motivation than before to change his policy course on anything, just about anything, including on the U.S., South Korea, and WMD development. And an emboldened Kim Jong-un, there is some debate about why North Korea's chosen to take this path. And some people will say North Korea is feeling defensive. And they'll point to his new South Korea unification policy and say, well, that's out of him feeling defensive.
Right.
I am of the school of thought that this is driven by Kim Jong-un feeling emboldened. I think he has gained a lot of confidence from the fact that he was able to weather difficulties at home during the near 4-year lockdown, right, of his borders during COVID. And the fact that he even improved the economy. According to the North Koreans, they achieved some economic growth in 2023. So not only weathering difficulties, but also managing to improve the economy, in their words. And of course, external factors, as we have talked about, the opportunities that he sees from great power competition. He's improving relations with Russia. Looking ahead, next week on the 7th, North Korea will have a Supreme People's Assembly session. The Supreme People's Assembly, for those of you who don't know, is the parliament of North Korea. Earlier this year, Kim Jong-un talked about defining North Korea's borders. And so next week on the 7th and probably on the 8th, they will define their new borders and codify these new borders into their constitution. Depending on how they define their borders and how strongly Kim Jong-un feels about letting the South Koreans know that he's serious about keeping those borders, I think we are likely to see increased tensions, military tensions on and around the Korean Peninsula for the time being. And I think you see the building blocks too, with Kim Jong-un showing himself at the uranium enrichment facility a few weeks ago. This ramping up of language in North Korean media about the importance of prioritizing defense development over everything else, and that this is the way to eventually grow the economy. So I think this is something to look out for. And also policy coordination, increasing policy coordination between the North Koreans and the Russians. We should keep in mind that when we were focused on North Korean media showing images of Kim Jong-un at the uranium facility, North Korean media had already shifted to something else, which was Kim Jong-un's meeting with Shoigu, the Russian president's special envoy, on the first year anniversary of Kim's summit with Putin in the Russian Far East. Interestingly, they had two meetings, one in the afternoon and one in the evening. They took a break. So which makes you wonder, well, maybe Shoigu had to report to Putin, maybe he was waiting for, but the important thing is, what was so important that this couldn't have been done through Matsugora, the Russian ambassador to Pyongyang?
Yeah.
It must have been something important. So increasing policy coordination between the two countries, definitely something to look out for.
More reasons to be scared. Thanks, Rachel. You've laid that out so fantastically. Thank you so much. And great framing to think about this pivot happening before the war. So not just opportunism on the part of North Koreans, but a deeper drive towards this rebalance. For the sake of time, I want to get to our audience questions. We've teed up a lot of things here, right? So we can keep talking about uranium. We can talk about possible provocations from the North Koreans around the election, other things that we've talked about, possibility of South Korea pursuing indigenous nuclear weapons, so much on the table. And now I want to turn to you all. So please raise your hand if you have a question. I see we've got one back there from Steve Cardman.
Yes, my question relates to what's going to happen here in the U.S. in just over 30 days, and the impact. I realize not all of you will be able to comment on this, but we have heard from you about the strengthening of the alliance structure, but we have one candidate, obviously, who in the past has not expressed strong support necessarily for the existing alliance structure in Asia and in Europe. I'm wondering what effect you think the election of the former president would have on our alliance structure in Asia, and how concerned are the Koreans and the Japanese about such a prospect?
Okay, so one question on election, and not everyone can address that question, right? Ambassador Stevens, we'll get a microphone over to you.
Hi, thank you. I was prompted by these excellent comments to ask you how you see the balloon wars in the context of the escalatory gray zone and motivations from North Korea. I mean, obviously, there's a long history of each side sending things back and forth. And from the South, it's always a domestic issue because you've got people saying this is communication, it's human rights, it's getting information to the North. And the North, you've got now trash coming back, but the comment being made that, if it's not trash, it could be biological weapons. It could be, and what about drones? Does that whole space kind of worry you? And is that also an area where maybe there's a difference of views with respect to maintaining deterrence and maintaining security within the zone?
Thank you very much. Okay, so two questions on the table for our panelists. Who wants to take a crack?
I think Ambassador Stevens was looking straight at me when she asked the second question, so I feel like I owe you an answer, Madam Ambassador. So I think this is a quintessential example of a gray zone type of escalation by North Korea. And I think it illustrates the particular sensitivity that North Korea has to information. Because, as you point out, the real concern about balloons going into North Korea, I don't think it's about a matter of sovereignty of North Korean airspace or something like that. It's a matter of when North Korea, when particularly the Kim regime sees something in the information environment that challenges the regime in some way, either symbolically or effectively against its own narratives, that's a place where it has a tendency to escalate in response. And so we've seen that in the history. Of course, the Sony hack is a great example. Sony Pictures Entertainment targeted because of the movie The Interview. But also, I think it's important to remember there was a significant escalatory rhetoric and buildup that took place in 2020. When the North Koreans made all these threats about the balloon launches, and Kim Yo Jong was there. It was making comments, and then actually Kim Young Chol came out of semi-retirement to also make these escalatory remarks about what would happen if South Korea didn't take some action. And then of course that led to the passage of the law, the so-called balloon law that put all these restrictions in place. And so I think it showed a case, unfortunately, where North Korea ramped up threats. And then got the result they were looking for, and I think this is a challenging precedent and a problem. So I do think that we should be concerned about this. The balloon wars. It's not just comedy here. It's something very real, and the potential for North Korea to do something further or lethal in this space. Because of that sensitivity the regime has about information, I think that is very real. So I would be concerned. This is one of the key potential aspects of how things could escalate, I think. Yeah.
Very good.
I mean, aside from being really disgusting, I think there's a certain amount of desperation to it. And then it is also, in fact, dangerous. Right. I mean, I think that there is a threat there. We take it quite seriously. We've had a number of senior level conversations with our ROC colleagues about this. The balloons are not just kind of free floating. There's hundreds of them, and they can be guided in some ways, so they can land on. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs, or land on YPO, that land on our ambassador's residence. So we take this potential threat very seriously.
Anything, Rachel? No?
I don't
Okay.
have anything to add.
More questions? Yeah. Election. Not everyone wants to talk about election, but if anyone does want to talk about election, opportunity to do so, not required, certainly. Rachel, I'm looking at you.
Yeah. Just realized that. I think, we expect if Harris is elected, that she would pretty much, I think the speculation at this point, the general assessment is that she will probably inherit a lot of Biden's policies, and probably including the emphasis on alliances and ROK, U.S., Japan security cooperation in the region. With Trump, I think it becomes more complicated. I think certainly from a South Korea, in South Korea, I think that there's a lot of concern about a Trump presidency. Just given past history, with the negotiations over defense spending, whether that South Korea would not come under more pressure to increase to shoulder more of the defense cost. I think that's certainly a concern. Potential implications for U.S. ROK joint military drills. Trump has called them war games, expensive war games in the past. There is a sentiment in South Korea, certainly, that if Trump is elected, the likelihood of South Korea acquiring some level of nuclear capability goes up. And of course, I think this is welcomed by some in South Korea who are for the idea of South Korea acquiring some nuclear capability. Yeah.
Thank you. Good analysis, Rachel. I want to take two more before we close out. We're pretty close on time. Yep, right here. Manik has a question. Anybody else? Or I'll add one that we got from our virtual audience.
Hi, Manik Mehta. I'm a syndicated journalist. I was very much interested in the suggestion of creating an Asian NATO. We had this Quad summit recently in Delaware, and some of the experts were suggesting, or rather hinting, that South Korea and the Philippines could join the Quad to strengthen it and create a kind of a deterrence going to your suggestion, how realistic is that? Do you envisage something like that in the future?
Okay, great question. And on a related note, institutionalization of the trilateral, that's another way to cut at that question. Do we have anything else from the audience, or is that going to bring us home? We've satisfied all your curiosities. All right, congratulations, team. We've done it. All right, but let's address this question about you could do Asian NATO or you could just do trilat institutionalization.
I'll jump on this one. So the Atlantic Council, of course, was originally founded as a think tank of NATO, and it's grown into having a more global approach. And one of the things that we do definitely focus on is looking at NATO's role in the world. And then also for my program, looking at the Indo-Pacific connection to NATO, connection to European issues. And so what I have learned through the process, and you've actually had some very deliberate dialogue on connecting security experts in the Indo-Pacific, and even some government officials and European NATO allies. Is that it's a bit different, right? The situation in the Indo-Pacific, strategically, politically, operationally, is so well. Actually, it's not even a bit different. It's a lot different. That means that the NATO model, as a whole, really, I don't think can be applied to the Indo-Pacific. And to be fair, NATO was created in a very specific set of political circumstances, and it's evolved and changed over time. And I do find that the term, the NATO, Asian NATO or an Indo-Pacific NATO, can be very inflammatory and to some audiences. But I do think the basic idea of taking some lessons from NATO and applying them in the Indo-Pacific context, and then building the connection between like-minded countries in the Indo-Pacific and NATO itself, these are both absolutely key and helpful for the security. And then in general, approaching security issues and defense issues in a more multilateral context is really important, but I think it's going to have to be essentially different layers and the lattice work term, these sorts of things, rather than one all-encompassing NATO-like institution. But I think greater institutionalization, moving beyond a series of overlapping trilats and the Quad. I mean, how do we connect these things together? I think that's going to continue to evolve, but I don't personally see the prospect of an Asian NATO as being realistic. Just, again, some of these elements that we could pull together, though, certainly there's a lot more space to grow that.
Yeah, I just certainly echo that. I think that, we've seen growing and strengthening of our alliance structure, whether it be the trilateral relationship, of course, mentioned Quad, we have AUKUS, another partnership, and in each of these cases, they serve in some ways different roles and in some ways overlapping roles that I think go a very long way towards demonstrating that there's a great deal of power in our shared values, our alignment, which I think is in fact very different than a relationship between Russia and China and North Korea and Iran. And I think the relationships that we are developing are enduring. And so, whether it's now or in the future, I think the value of alliance development and alliance management is self-evident, and I have every reason to be optimistic about the future of that.
Rachel, anything to add there?
No, I think both gentlemen have said it very well. Don't have anything to add.
Yeah. And just if we remember 5 years ago how different things were, and 10 years ago how different things were, this idea of GSOMIA, where we just need an agreement for Japan and Korea to share information directly with one another rather than going through the United States every time, completely voluntary agreement, but how politicized it was and how difficult it was. And looking where we are today, it's just a world apart. So very impressive, a lot of room to grow, certainly more, but such incredible progress made thus far. So a lot of people to thank in making this possible. So please give a hand to Chelsea in the back there. Our wonderful intern, Nabiha. Nabiha greeted you downstairs when you first entered. Thank you, Nabiha. Peter and Bradley, who make us all look good on camera. And Tom, our president. Kathy, our chairperson. And last but not least, our wonderful panelists here today. Please help me give them a round of applause.